Well, good morning from the Oklahoman's newsroom. Dave Morris, happy to be joined by Oklahoma U.S. Senator James Lankford. Sir, how are you?
Doing very well, Dave. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time. I know it's a busy day in Washington, a busy time of year in Washington, so we certainly appreciate your time this morning. A variety of topics, and before we get your take on Groundhog Day and who you have for the Super Bowl, this morning was the National Prayer Breakfast. How'd that go this morning?
It actually went very well this morning. Chaplain Black, who's the chaplain of the Senate, was the one who led the main speaking. Obviously, the president spoke as well. Chaplain Black did a phenomenal job of just kind of laying out the issues about prayer. First time to be able to speak for President Trump, obviously, as president for this. And he did a good job just being able to lay out just the value of religious liberty as a nation, all faiths, everyone being able to live their faith out and to be protected as a nation. So it was a good positive message.
I know the president mentioned the Johnson Amendment this morning at the prayer breakfast. This is something that you introduced a bill in regards to earlier this week to expand free speech for houses of worship and non-profits, the Free Speech Fairness Act. You want to walk us through that?
It is actually. It was interesting. In 1954, at that time, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson was mad about some nonprofits and some of the things that had happened in his own campaign. So he retaliated against them by putting in something into the IRS code, basically blocking anyone that works for a nonprofit from saying anything that could be taken as political. Well, it's not been enforced by the IRS. So nonprofits really don't know how to interpret it. Churches, houses of worship don't know how to interpret it, but it's always been this thing that's hung over them that's in the law. So what we want to do is be able to pull this away. There's no reason the IRS should assign an IRS person to stand at the back of a church or to go to a nonprofit event for the arts or whatever it may be, just to make sure no one says anything political. It's not the role of the IRS to be able to monitor American speech. Anyone who works for a nonprofit still has their Second Amendment rights, still has the right to assembly, still has the right to due process, but for some reason they lose their right to free speech. So we don't want to do this. Now, at the same time, we don't want to turn in nonprofits into political organizations. So this is not about giving campaign dollars or funneling money into campaigns. This is something just simply that speech, nothing about campaign dollars, nothing about campaign finance. We think nonprofits should stay out of that, but they shouldn't lose their right to free speech.
We're chatting via Skype with U.S. Senator James Lankford, joining us this morning here in the Oklahoman's video studio. He's in Washington, D.C. As we mentioned, he attended the National Prayer Breakfast this morning. He tweeted afterwards, and Senator, you said prayer has always played a vital role in uniting and making us a more generous, more loving, and more forgiving people. Let me tee this question up this way. Our producer, Paige Dillard, in the booth, said she was watching the news this morning. She has a 6-year-old who saw the news and said, "Why is everyone so mad?" Does it seem to you like a nation is divided, that it's a little more so than usual?
It is. I think every time we come out of a big heated national election, we always face a lot of the leftover angst, both the energy building up to it and then the angst after it. So that's a typical cycle. It does seem to be more this time than normal. There's a lot that can be done, as simple as your statement from my tweet and for what happened the National Day of Prayer today, to be able to encourage people to be able to find ways that, as was mentioned today, not just common ground, but higher ground. How do we get the opportunity to be able to respect each other and our differences, whether it be differences in faith, or to be able to find opportunities for individuals that may have differences of opinion, but the same faith, to be able to stop and pray together. It's one of the things that we do here in the Senate. I have a Bible study in my office on Tuesday mornings. There's a bipartisan group that gets together on Wednesday mornings just to be able to pray for each other. And it's a running joke in that group that it's much more difficult to stab someone in the back on the Senate floor when you prayed with them in the morning. Now, it's not impossible, but it's just much more difficult. And it's one of those things that we can look at as a nation and say, what would happen if in the heat of an argument, instead of walking away mad, we sat down together and said, okay, let's just pray together and then try to see if we can resolve this. It'd be a very different response.
What about the pace? President Trump seems to be issuing several executive orders. Do you notice a difference in the pace? Is it because this president is made some campaign promises and he's just knocking out, doing what he said he was going to do? Or is it still somewhat different than what you've seen in the past?
No, I think President Obama in his first year in 2009 knocked out a lot of executive orders in his first 2 weeks as well. So I don't think the pace is any different. Okay. There were some mistakes made. I mean, I've talked to media before about the refugee and immigration piece. It didn't have all the details in it, and they didn't do the advance work on it. And so it made for a chaotic 4 days. It really was 4 days where embassies read it one way, Department of Homeland Security read it another way, airlines read it another way, and even airline to airline, they read it different ways. And so it took 4 days to get a consistent message out, say, here's what it means, and here's what it doesn't mean. It doesn't like block legal permanent residence. It doesn't block legal visa holders. A lot of people overreacted, quite frankly, and applied it in this various ways and created a lot of chaos. Department of Homeland Security's cleaned that up. That's made this very big, high-profile executive order. But again, presidents usually in their first couple of weeks do a lot of executive orders to be able to say, we're changing direction.
Do you see that as perhaps a learning curve for the new administration?
Sure it is. Yeah, every administration comes in, there's a big learning curve, and you'll see that throughout the administration. Again, the most famous example of that is when Obamacare was first rolled out and put into place. There was about 3 months of total chaos in the insurance market, and everyone was hammering on the Obama administration saying, gosh, how come you couldn't do this? And you just came across incompetent. So every administration faces moments like that. I get that. The opposite party always attacks the other one and says you're totally incompetent, you're not getting this right. In some ways, we need to give both groups a break to be able to work through this. No one's perfect in it, and they're dealing with millions of people in the federal bureaucracy, especially early on as they're trying to work through everything.
Chatting via Skype with U.S. Senator James Lankford, joining us to talk about a variety of things. And one of the big things earlier this week was President Trump nominating Neil Gorsuch for the U.S. Supreme Court, something you were in favor of.
Yeah, I am actually in favor of. He put out a list of 21 people as he was campaigning, and then when he became president, reinforced that again. Of that list, Neil Gorsuch was actually my first pick on the list. He's somebody that Oklahomans know well. He served in the 10th Circuit. He's someone who's had great respect from both sides of the aisle. In fact, when he was placed on the 10th Circuit Court, he passed by what's called voice vote in the Senate. That's a unanimous vote. No one had opposition. At the time, Barack Obama was a senator. He voted for him. Hillary Clinton was a senator. She voted for him. Chuck Schumer, who's now the minority leader, voted for him. Joe Biden voted for him. He had wide support among Republicans as well. He's had tremendous respect for his writing and for what he has done as well. He's been an outspoken advocate for what's called separation of powers. That is, the executive branch has a job. They should do just their job, not the judicial job, not the legislative job. Legislature should do theirs, and the judicial branch should do theirs. Now, that used to not be a radical concept, but for some reason now it has become that a lot of people say, well, the executive branch and the president should have a lot more power to do what they want. Quite frankly, I think each person has a job. Do your job. Neil Gorsuch has been very outspoken on that.
You issued a statement and a press release that night following that nomination. And one of the things you addressed in that statement was Merrick Garland. I'll give you a chance here. When people ask you, what about Merrick Garland last year? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so Merrick Garland's one of those issues that will constantly be talked about. Why don't we just put Merrick Garland in the court? It's because we were in the last year of a presidential election. That has been the typical pattern. Even the New York Times, when it came out with its stories about Merrick Garland and about the process, had to say it's not normal for a president to get a nomination onto the Supreme Court in their last year of their presidency. Now, this opening happened earlier in the year than what is typical, but we were still right in the middle of a presidential election. It's the same rule that Joe Biden had when he was the senator and he led the judiciary and made very clear that in the final year of President Bush's term, that there would not be any individuals filled into the Supreme Court. It's the same rule that Chuck Schumer had, that 18 months actually before the second President Bush, Bush 43, before he left office, Chuck Schumer stood up in a group and said, we will apply the same rule. If there's an opening on the court, we're too close to the election, we will not allow anyone to come in. So that is typical. I know Americans, as they watch it, try to figure that out and try to figure out some of the history, but that's been a normal process for a very long time. But this is different now. This is the first year of a new president. First year of President Obama, Sonia Sotomayor was recommended by the president onto the court. Republicans and Democrats worked together. There was no filibuster of Sonia Sotomayor, though philosophically she is very much opposed by a lot of conservatives in some of her judicial philosophy. But there was no filibuster. She passed overwhelmingly. 2 years later, Elena Kagan was put on the court by President Obama. Again, there was no filibuster. She was put on the court overwhelmingly. The interesting historical fact is there's never been a nomination for a Supreme Court that has ever been filibustered in the history of the country. So this will be an interesting conversation that's gone through the course of this year, as Democrats have threatened for the first time ever to be able to filibuster a Supreme Court nominee.
Be interesting to watch the process. Speaking of nominees, President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and I think you have a little bit of news on that.
Well, she's been highly controversial. There's been a lot of individuals that have called our office to say she doesn't have experience in public education before, and they're very concerned about that. And a lot of the teachers' unions and individuals have been very active on that, and quite frankly, just a lot of teachers that may or may not be active in their unions are concerned about what it is. Here's the shift for Betsy DeVos. I am going to support her for this, and I know there'll be a lot of folks that will be very upset about that one way or the other. Here's the reason why. Betsy DeVos has with two reasons. One is it is typical for the president to be able to get their nominees in their cabinet, especially in the first time. That happened as a courtesy to President Obama. That will happen to President Trump as well, for them to be able to get their selection. Betsy DeVos has been an individual that's been very passionate about education her entire life. She has been very focused on inner city education, on rural education, individuals that are coming out of poverty. How can they get access to greater educational opportunities? That's been her driving passion, and she's lived that out not only in her finances, but lived that out with her time and her organization. She's been very clear that she is supportive of public education, and we pulled several of her quotes and put it up on our website for individuals that say she hates public education. I would never put someone in that hates public education. That is the dominant form of education in the United States, and we need our Secretary of Education to support what happens in public education, because that's most students. My kids are in public education and grew up in public education. So that's a major part of what we should do as a nation to be able to honor that and to be able to do that. I've had folks that have called me and said she supports charter schools. I remind everyone, President Obama supported charter schools. President Bush supported charter schools. The last 5 secretaries of education have been outspoken supporters of charter schools, and for individual parents to be able to make the decision where their kids go to school. At the end of the day, the Secretary of Education is not the lead of a big education board that runs the entire nation and all education. The role of the Secretary of Education is to help facilitate dialogue among the states. And Betsy DeVos's assurance to me is her focus is states and local districts make the decisions about their education, not the federal government. She has promised not to push any certain curriculum on any classroom or on any state, or to push any certain educational model on any state. Each state should be able to make their choice. That's what I would ask of any Secretary of Education, is that they're passionate about the students that don't have access to good educational opportunities, but they're also passionate about making sure our state makes the decision about education rather than that being done in Washington, D.C.
There you have it, U.S. Senator James Lankford lending his support behind President Trump's nomination of Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary. James, sir, I'll get you out of here on this. I noticed you tweeted a hashtag earlier this week, if anyone's in Washington, D.C., to have coffee with you, hashtag Java with James. Anyone taking you up on that yet?
We had about 20 people that drop by this Wednesday. Every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., we just put on a pot of coffee and invite any Oklahoman that's in town, whether it's a tourist or someone coming from our conference, or Oklahomans that just live in the area, to be able to stop by our office. We call our office the Oklahoma Embassy in Washington, D.C. And so if you need to come speak Okie and be a safe place, it's a good spot to be able to stop by on a Wednesday morning at 9 a.m.
Well, I mentioned Groundhog Day and the Super Bowl off the top of this. We'll get out of here on that. Groundhog Day, Groundhog apparently didn't see his shadow, so that means 6 more weeks of winter. Are you a cold or a warm weather guy?
I'm a warm weather guy. I've enjoyed our basically moderate winter this time, with a couple of single degree exceptions that we've had it. But I'd rather have warm than hot any day, and I can assure you my wife would rather have warm than hot any day. And so I'm not sure I trust the rodent, though. We'll see what God does on the weather. And on the Super Bowl this weekend, I have to tell you, I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan, and I was absolutely devastated when they lost to Green Bay, and I was secretly overjoyed when Atlanta just smashed Green Bay right after that the very next week. But it is tough to bet against the Patriots when you get to the Super Bowl. Though Atlanta looks good, I have to say I'd have to tip it to the Patriots. Hopefully they will inflate the ball correctly when they get to the game. It'll be a good, fun game, though.
It's U.S. Senator James Lankford, sir. We appreciate your time this morning. Best of luck this session.
Thank you very much.
More political coverage can be found on our website at newsok.com, also in the Oklahoman. The Senator's website, by the way, lankford.senate.gov.